essentially, if you already have a working PyHF development environment, then just hang tight. But for everyone else, we're going to basically do kind of a follow along. I guess before we get started, does anyone here? It looks like everyone is either on a Mac or a Linux machine, but is anyone running Windows? Okay, great. That makes things trivially easy then. So, so the first thing we're going to do is I'm going to move some Zoom controls out of the way so I can actually see what I'm doing. So the first thing we're going to do is we're just going to Google pyhf, and so then I'll blow up my screen a little bit. So we're going to then go to the GitHub. Well, actually, yeah, so we'll go to the GitHub, but then we'll actually go to the docs. And on this left-hand side here, on the read the docs, you can see that there's this developing section. So we're going to go there, and it basically tells us how to go ahead and get started. So there's a few different ways of doing this. We're going to basically walk through this, but an alternative approach is, instead of trying to actually set up the development environment in a virtual environment that you control yourself, you can instead use Nox, which is kind of a task running system, to try and make this even easier for you. So while I basically go ahead and, for the most part, use these sets of instructions to just try and make my development processes kind of in one virtual environment that I control, today we're going to actually follow along these instructions with Nox. So I'm going to do this in real time with people in a Docker container, just so you can see that everything's kind of being done live. So I'm going to do docker run rm-ti python 3.11. I think 3.12, everything is working now, but I don't think we have all the tests ported. Okay, so I'm going to first just create a virtual environment. I can type. Okay, actually also, just quick raise of hands. Raise your hand if you have a working CPython on your laptop that is Python 3.8 or higher. Okay, and so, and raise your hand if you know how to make a virtual environment with that CPython. Okay, great. So everyone knows what's up. I'm going to just simply upgrade pip and install wheel just to make sure that that's available for us. Okay, so going back to these instructions, here we suggest using SSH keys because you need to be using some sort of sign-on system with GitHub in general these days. But since I'm in my Docker container, I'm simply going to do this instead just with HTTPS. So actually I can do this from memory. So if we just do git clone https github.com scikit-hep pyhf, this will go ahead and clone the full repository. And for people on video, you can also just get those from the URLs from the code button on the GitHub repository. So this is already cloned down. So then what I'm also going to do is I'm going to do pip install Nox, because Nox is going to be this task runner that will take care of everything for us. Okay, so now I'm going to cd into the pyhf directory. And if we go back to the developing instructions, it's down here it says that we could use Nox to try and do these development sessions instead. And indeed, if we if we ls in here, we can see that inside of our directory, we have a Knox file, and this Knox file basically contains different sessions for where sessions are different kind of known commands. So if we do Knox -- list, then we can see here that we have these different sets of commands. So we have kind of a session that will do linting for us. We have a session that will run the tests. And we have all these other ones as well. So in general, if you so while it's useful to also be able to just kind of drop into a session and play around interactively without having to only be in one of these sessions, the very first thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to install pyhf in an editable mode. So I'm going to do python-m pip install -e for editable. Thank you. -e, and then dot, where dot is just saying, install from the local directory. And now we're going ahead and installing pyhf. Okay, great. So we now have pyhf and all of its dependencies. So we did an editable install. And so, for example, if we did, if we look at like SciPy, for example, there's a whole bunch of stuff right off the screen because they put their whole license text in the license file. But if we notice here, like grep on location, we notice here that SciPy has been installed in our Python virtual environment site packages directory like we would normally expect, but because we did an editable install with pyhf, if we do python-m pip show pyhf, we see that it also is in site packages, but the site packages install for pyhf is actually a symbolic link back to our local directory, which means that as we're going ahead and actually doing development, any files that we change under the source pyhf directory, these will automatically be updated for us because we're directly changing the source files that the Python interpreter is accessing. So that means that as we're developing, if we want to test something, we don't have to reinstall pyhf every time. You can simply edit and then run. I think people might already know that, but I just wanted to kind of go over that quickly. Okay, so if the development environment has quite a bit of actual things in here, so if we less our pyproject.toml, what? Oh, okay, I'm gonna doc. Okay, apparently less isn't in here, so I'll just do bad habits and do cat. So if we check out what's actually inside of the development environment, we see here that the developer extra has all these additional extras. It has all of the computational backends. It also includes the test extra as well as the documentation extra. So there's quite a bit of stuff here if you were going to try and install everything. But instead, what I would in general recommend is just going ahead and using this, just doing the pip install locally, and then anytime you wanted to try and run the full test suite, just using Knox. So again, if we do Knox list, we can see that we have like the lint action, the tests, and others. So for example, if I do Knox session and then lint, then we'll see that we're getting output on what's the actual things that are being run right now. We're installing pre-commit hooks and then running linting sessions that will follow after. And so all this install is happening the first time, but Nox is creating a virtual environment for us in the backend called Nox Lint that is taking care of all this so that it can be reused later. Okay. Okay, so we can see that, yeah, if we now rerun that session, that it's basically just running all of the linting checks for us, which is nice. But in general, we would also recommend, since we have pre-commit checks, we would also recommend that you install python-m pip install pre-commit, and that you also you install pre-commit, so every time you make a commit, now moving forward, all of our linting checks will run automatically for you, so that it, if there's things that would automatically get caught in the continuous integration cycle, that those get caught before you even push. So if we do pre-commit run -- all files, you'll also see that all this runs. Okay, so if you actually want to do, so you're pretty much already set up to do development, but if you want to also run tests locally, then if we again go to the Nox list, then you'd see that there's this tests, and this is for 3.8, 3.9, 3.10, and 3.11. And since I'm on Python 3.11, I would do something like Nox -s, which is short for sessions, and then tests 3.11. And this basically kind of runs a subset of the tests. It doesn't run all the tests, because there's also different tests for the notebooks and additional things, but this would go ahead and, as you can see, it's currently installing into another virtual environment, test 3.11. It's installing all of the computational backend ends as well as the test dependencies. And so this would, and then beyond that, it's also now going to start to try and run the full test suite. Okay, so one thing I will note though is that since each Nox session is using its own specific virtual environment, and so there will be some duplication. And so if you find that things, if you're very constrained on the amount of storage that you have on your machine, so, or if you're maybe trying to do development on a cluster and in your home directory, you only might say have like 5 gigs of space or something, you might want to not use Nox, but instead just go ahead and instead just install something like this, pip install, and then with the all and tests, just so you can try and install the minimal amount of dependencies. But okay, so we're now basically at this point set up with a full development environment, so you could go ahead and get writing to code. But maybe just a very quick kind of contributor cycle comment is, while we basically have a short overview of how you should lint, test, and run coverage reports and things like that, if you, as well as some maintainer notes for doing release checklists, if you actually want to get started with making a pull request, then what we'll actually do is we'll go back to our GitHub, and we find that there's this contributing.md file. And here, this basically gives you an overview of how we would kind of recommend as some best practices for contributing. So in general, we always recommend that before you open a pull request, unless you've already talked with a developer about this, go ahead and make an issue. And if you're not sure if the thing that you want to discuss is really a code problem or a code feature, we also have GitHub discussions, where if you have a question about use, or if you have a question in general, the GitHub discussion is a great place to have that, and we can always turn that into a GitHub issue later if it makes sense. But so before you open a PR, please open an issue to discuss. we have some examples from like Nikolai Hartman in the past, who did a really great job of a contribution. And then we basically also have the whole pull request kind of procedure outlined here for you that can hopefully be a good way to get going. Something that I think is also important is we want to try and make sure that we recognize the people that are contributing in any way, shape, or form, be that to the documentation or to the code itself or to adding more tests. So please make sure that you go ahead and always, if it's your first time contributing, add your name to the contributors list so that we have a record that's public for who's been making contributions to the project. Okay, so without basically taking the time to kind of go through and do all that, do it like kind of a short example of like a toy issue. I think everyone should now be in a space where they have a working development environment. So raise your hand if you if you ran the install commands and anything failed. Okay, so sounds good. So at this point, this means that everybody should be basically tuned up and ready to write code later this afternoon or to write docs. So since we have 50 minutes before our lunch break, I'm going to suggest that we now pivot to the birds of a feather topic.